Okay, let's dive into one of the most polarizing and frankly unsettling legal cases in modern British history, a case that poses a really difficult question.
Is Lucy Letby a prolific serial killer, one of the worst in history? Or is she the victim of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice? That is the question at the absolute heart of this case. It's a story that seemed closed, but believe me, it is now wide open. So to really understand why this is all being debated so fiercely, we have to go back to the beginning, to the official verdict that sent shockwaves across the country.
So in 2023, former neonatal nurse Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And for these crimes, she was given 15 whole-life prison terms. And that means she will never be eligible for parole. It's one of the most severe sentences that can be handed down in the UK.
Right. So what was it? What was the evidence that convinced a jury to hand down a verdict like that? Let's break it down.
The prosecution's case was really built on a few key pillars. On the medical side, they argued that a couple of babies were poisoned with insulin and that others were killed by having air deliberately injected into their tiny bodies, causing something called an air embolism. And this was all backed up by a really powerful circumstantial link. This tragic spike in deaths and collapses, it only seemed to happen when Lucy Letby was on duty. And the moment she was moved off the unit, it stopped.
And then you have what was probably the most damning piece of evidence of all. It's a Post-it note found in her home, and on it were the words, "I am evil. I did this." I mean, you can imagine how that must have sounded to the jury like a direct, chilling confession.
But here's the thing. After the trial, the story didn't end. A completely new narrative started to take shape, and it's being driven by a growing number of international medical and legal experts who believe this conviction is just fundamentally wrong. And look, this isn't just some fringe theory online. We're talking about a massive legal challenge. Letby's new defense team has put together this huge file with 31 different reports from 26 international experts. They are formally asking an independent body to review the whole thing as a potential miscarriage of justice. And this gets to the absolute core of the debate. The prosecution's story was about one evil person acting alone. But this new campaign? It paints a totally different picture. A series of awful tragedies caused not by one person, but by a failing hospital, by substandard care, and maybe even by an infection outbreak on an overstretched ward. So this new movement isn't just making vague claims. They are systematically taking apart the prosecution's case piece by piece and re-examining the evidence. Let's start with the insulin charges. You could argue this was the scientific linchpin for the prosecution. They presented it as cold, hard proof of deliberate poisoning. They even told the jury there could be no doubt about it.
But now, a new 100-page report from a bioengineering expert says, hold on a second. It claims there's no scientific justification whatsoever for being that certain. The report argues that the test they used just wasn't reliable enough to tell the difference between natural insulin and the synthetic kind Letby was accused of using. Basically, it wasn't a forensic-grade test, and a more precise one was never done.
Okay, but what about the note? You can debate the science, sure, but what about that confession? How do you explain that away?
Well, the defense now has a completely different interpretation. They're saying those notes weren't a confession at all. They claim they were part of a therapeutic journaling exercise suggested by a therapist to help her process the trauma and fear of being blamed. And they point out that the same notes also contain phrases like slander and victimization and insist she's innocent, painting a much more complicated picture.
So that brings us to what a lot of people saw as the circumstantial smoking gun. The prosecution made a very powerful point. When Lucy Letby was moved to a desk job in July 2016, the crisis on the unit just stopped. But her supporters point to another huge thing that happened at the exact same time. The hospital's neonatal unit was officially downgraded. That meant it stopped caring for the most premature and vulnerable babies, the ones born before 32 weeks. So they argue the death rate dropped not because Letby was gone, but because the highest-risk infants were now being sent somewhere else.
So you have these two completely conflicting narratives. Where does all of this go from here? What happens now?
Well, the legal road ahead is a long one. After the 2023 conviction, Letby has already tried to appeal twice, and both were rejected in 2024. So now her last real hope rests with this formal application to something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or the CCRC. And while that's happening, there's a whole separate public inquiry looking into the hospital's failings. And that report is due out around 2026.
So yeah,
Everything now really hangs on the CCRC. It's an independent body, and its job is not to decide if she's guilty or innocent. Its only job is to look at the new evidence and new arguments and decide if there's a real possibility that a court might overturn the conviction. If they think there is, they can send the whole case back for a new appeal.
And all of this leaves us with this huge, profound question hanging over one of the most disturbing cases of our time. Was a monster brought to justice? Or was a grieving community and a struggling hospital looking for an answer so badly that maybe, just maybe, they relied on science that wasn't as certain as it seemed? The final chapter in this story, well, it's a long way from being written.